So the language loss then is very serious in Tikahtnu for DENA'INA. It's serious also for Shukpiak, and for Yupik, our third native language of Cook Inlet, it is not nearly as serious, but it is still something to be aware of as a potential issue in the future. And certainly the fact that you have about 3/4 of the villages where people are predominantly speaking English in the home is a suggestion of the fact that we're definitely seeing language shift in the Yupik communities as well. A very strong language shift that we'll see the ramifications of in coming decades if it's not changed. And so what's being done, if anything, about this? As you read several articles about, so I'm not going to belabor the points. I'm going to kind of let the articles speak for themselves. But as you read about, there's been some very active efforts here on the Kenai Peninsula and working with elders from the inland area, among other places, on preserving DENA'INA language in a way that we have a full sense of the complexity of the language. That's been done by a variety of people. So for example, Helen Dick, one of our premier elders in terms of knowledge of DENA'INA language, who's been very passionate about language revitalization work. Joel Isaac, Andrea Ivanoff, and Jennifer Williams. I'm honored to say that I know all three, Andrea and Jennifer, who you should call Professor Ivanoff and Professor Williams, as my DENA'INA language instructors and as just people I know from other contexts at work. Joel I also know from work. They're all fantastic people, wonderful people that I'm honored to know. Not only are they all wonderful people, but they're all wonderful students of DENA'INA language who have worked very hard to store, to record, to learn the knowledge from people like Helen, elders, to make sure that we fully understand this language so that we can teach it properly. So elders have been obviously foundational to this work and that knowledge, and of the work of things like the DENA'INA Language Institute, which is a project associated with Kenaitze Indian tribe, and that partly started out because of a DOE grant, but so there was an earlier iteration. And then the DENA'INA Language and Culture Revitalization Project. So important work being done, much of it under the auspices of Kenaitze Indian tribe. So one other way in which tribal communities continue to be incredibly important forces in cultural issues in Cook Inlet today. I appreciated in the readings that we did the sense of adaptiveness. So Professor Isaac talked about the situation in which Dr. Seuss stories were being used as a way of translating the language and getting the language down, and in a way that it could be, interesting and applicable for teaching. And then that there was kind of a sense that that wasn't working quite right, and that wasn't quite right how DENA'INA gets used traditionally and spoken traditionally, these kind of whimsical Dr. Seussy kind of stories. And so then they developed these Niku stories, which comes from the DENA'INA word for, one of the DENA'INA words, I should say, for hopping. And so this little girl that likes to hop about in her different everyday activities. And I loved that. And I really loved what Joe Isaac said about that. He said a big part of our language work is, where does language come from? Language is a response to place. It's the form of communication. So this is why we have to do the language with the culture. They're not separate. So learning the language from elders, part of that is putting it in a cultural context where that language can naturally emerge from, right? I remember a conversation I had with a close friend one time, and he didn't understand why language work takes so long, why it takes years and years and indeed decades to properly understand and record a language so that it can be properly taught, and why it takes years and decades to develop the kinds of materials you need to teach it properly to the next generations. And one of the things that it's hard for people to understand is that it's not like people's heads are dictionaries that you can just place down and every single word that exists in the language now exists in a book. Instead, language is something, as you know from your own speaking, that comes about spontaneously and organically in living situations. And also there are complexities and nuances, and that is particularly so in a language like DENA'INA. DENA'INA is richly polysynthetic, and what I mean by richly polysynthetic, so as I've said before, polysynthetic languages are languages where, among other things, you can conjugate the verbs in many different ways. There are many prefixes and suffixes, many ways you can attach to the root verb, and as a result, any given verb can potentially be said many different ways, depending on, for example, the shape of the object being described, the general direction of the movement, the temporality of how often it gets done, who's doing it, all sorts of different factors. So it's a very complex language, so simply recording vocabulary is not enough. Instead, we are trying to better understand and discover the root linguistic structures, the verbal structures, the syntax, and different things. Things which for most of us, when we think about our language, are implicitly in there, right? But implicitly in there, in terms of how we use it, doesn't mean that it's down on paper yet, right? That's an intense work, a labor of effort that takes many, many years, if not decades, to properly understand the inner workings of a language from the insides out. There are parts that are just implicitly part of it that then have to be systematized and properly understood so that they can become part of a language teaching program, at least the way in which we do language teaching often in our educational programs. I liked also the role of Zoom to keep the work going once the COVID pandemic hit. So again, the adaptiveness that we need in language teaching and language work. That language preservation and recording and documentation work feeds into things like DENA'INA dictionaries, DENA'INA grammar, DENA'INA language books, all of which are incredibly important. It also feeds into, informs the basis for much of our language work in a university settings. And so, for example, at KPC, you can find DENA'INA classes taught, you can find Yupik languages taught, you can find OPTIMISM language taught. I should give a brief shout out to the OPTIMISM instructor, Dr. Sandra Stroganoff-Stewart, who is another wonderful person who we are extremely grateful to have, the chair, director of the Alaska Native Studies program, and then also a fantastic teacher of OPTIMISM. We also have, across the UA system as a whole, classes in Inupiaq, classes in Alutiiq or Shukpiaq, and others. You'll notice that we have a minor in Alaska Native Studies we're also working on. I'm not sure if these have gone public or not yet, but there's other great language programs that are being developed, different kinds of things to formalize the way we take classes about Alaska Native languages. Out there on Kodiak College, they obviously do a lot of Alutiiq Shukpiaq teaching, given that Kodiak is traditionally the homelands of the Koniag, Alutiiq, or Shukpiaq people. So good work being done in college classrooms. Is that the same as having it in your home growing up? No. Can it still be very powerful? Yes, it can be very, very powerful. And if you're thinking about taking some of these classes, I would encourage you to do so. I don't gain anything from you taking them. I don't teach these classes. It's purely because I think this is an incredibly important work for us to be doing and taking part in. The more people that can be speaking it, the stronger. Think of it like this is a weird way to say it, but think of it a bit like an insurance policy of when we talk about language revitalization work, because potentially some people will use it more than others, right? So just having like 1 or 2 people take a class is good. Having 100 people take a class is awesome. Think of it also as developing a community of practice, a language community where people can speak it to each other in a daily way. So the more people speak in it, the better, in my opinion. There are a lot of other efforts as well. I could mention language documentation work, for example, done by my predecessor, Dr. Alan Boris. He worked extensively with DENA'INA elders, Peter Kalfornsky, very often, but a lot of other DENA'INA elders as well. As a result of that, he developed a DENA'INA grammar book. You'll sometimes hear people call it the Brown Book. It is literally brown, and very important work that he did. Work by other peoples as well, other scholars. So you have people like Jim Carey. He's a linguist out of UAF. He's done tremendous amount of work with a variety of Athabascan languages here in Alaska, and he developed a topical dictionary for DENA'INA that I refer to regularly. I find it to be an incredibly useful book and is very important for our language work. And it also has a really great introduction that explains a lot of particularities of DENA'INA language and DENA'INA history that I really like. There's been work on the development of a place names map. So yeah, also work by people to develop place names maps. We have a few different versions of those, having been worked on by different people. One of which I'm familiar with. It's just excellent work, but I'm not sure if it's public yet, or published yet. So that's the only reason I'm not mentioning it yet. Work being done just recording sort of basics about the language, as well as much more extensive publications by Alaska Native Language Center up at UAF. and as you read about in the reading by the National Park Service, an audio repository by University of Alaska Fairbanks and National Park Service, which have worked together. I'll actually show you that. It's actually pretty cool. It's called kanaga.org. It's a Project Jukebox site. It's got all sorts of different, oops, not what I wanted, recordings of DENA'INA language. Really cool, right? That a kind of repository that you can search through and find out about the different things that they have. A lot of which you'd actually have to go there, but some of which not. So anyways, pretty cool stuff. I don't know why it's not allowing. I think they've got a computer issue going on right now. And then there are things for other things as well as far as cultural and language preservation. So I just briefly made a reference of this, the Never Alone game. It was partly a product of the Cook Inlet Tribal CTIC Commission, and it's a cool game to check out that kind of celebrates Alaska Native cultures, and particularly of Inupiaq and Yupik areas. So anyways, lots of different things that are being done. Most importantly to mention, though, is the many, many elders past and present, some with us, some not. We mentioned Helen Dick. We could mention others. Andrew Beluda, James Wilson, many others who have shared their knowledge, shared their expertise, so that we could better understand the language as well as better understand the culture of traditional DENA'INA culture and language. So it's a wonderful thing. You also did a reading that briefly mentioned House Bill 216, which was eventually signed a little bit after that article that you read by, at the time, Governor Sean Parnell, who's now our chancellor. You read that it recognizes the following languages, all of our Alaska Native languages. It's official languages of the site. As the text mentions, it does not actually require government services or documents to be provided in these languages, so it doesn't incur an additional cost to the government. It's instead was meant to be a symbolic gesture, but I would argue that symbolic gestures and acts can be incredibly important, right? It is a very public marker of the fact that the state of Alaska was recognizing the painful history there and the fact of sort of forced English assimilation and acknowledging the indigenous presence on these lands long before there was a state called Alaska. So, 15-hour sit-in, but for some very important results of public recognition, and sometimes that's the most important thing, is just some recognition, some actual being seen on these language issues. Overall, I remain actually pretty optimistic, cautiously optimistic about language revitalization in these areas. Partly from my perspective as kind of a sociolinguist, that's the linguistic tradition I come out of it as a linguistic anthropologist, is sociolinguistics rather than descriptive linguistics, although I am familiar with that work as well. As a sociolinguist, I think about langue versus parole. It comes from a guy by the name of Saussure, a linguist, a French linguist. But the idea of language, there's language as like a code, as a formal thing, right, as kind of a core of ideas of how the language works. And then there's parole, which is how people actually actively use the language in their everyday lives. And to me, figuring out the langue, properly recording all the ins and outs is something that does take years and decades, and that is an ongoing process and a hard process and a lot of work. But there's also just getting it, people speaking it is something that people have been doing for years as far as this language revitalization, and I think been doing a really good job of. You still hear that spoken in a variety of contexts today, in bits and pieces here and there, on certain signs and things like that. I take those as very optimistic notes. And on that note, I would conclude this video with a quote from Ellen Cushman. She says, "Peoplehood and perseverance are sustained through native languages in every body of work, casual conversation, or legal document that uses a tribal language. Every time we use it, it's helping the situation." That's it for this video.